On Broadway, in the old heart of New York, stands a cathedral with no god, the Woolworth Building, a Gothic phantom haunting the canyons of Capitol. 792 feet of lace-like terracotta climbing a modern steel frame. Its vaulted lobby glitters with gold, a sanctuary for a new religion, profit, a monument built by a single man's will, paid for in cash, financed by an empire of nickels and dimes. The air is different here, just before dawn. In the canyons of Lower Manhattan, the atmosphere grows thick and heavy, tasting of salt from the harbor and the cold iron of fire escapes. Below, on the pavement of Broadway, the city is a sleeping machine, its gears momentarily still. But look up. High above the asphalt veins, a crown of green patinated copper catches the first, ghostly suggestion of daylight. It pierces the bruised purple of the night sky, a Gothic spire that has no business being here, a phantom cathedral airlifted from a forgotten European century and set down amongst the temples of modern capital. This is the Woolworth Building. For a fleeting moment, as the light shifts from gray to silver, it seems holy, transcendent. The intricate terracotta lacework climbing its flanks glows with a soft, internal luminescence, as if the stone itself has absorbed a century of prayers. Gargoyles, crouched like patient demons, stare down from the 30th floor, their silent judgment reserved for the generations of mortals who have scurried below. The building is a prayer, yes, but a prayer to whom? Not to any god recognized by the old world. Its stained glass does not tell the story of saints, but of industry. Its vaulted ceilings do not echo with choirs, but with the ghostly clatter of typewriters and the phantom ring of stock tickers. This is the Cathedral of Commerce, a name given in reverence, but one that lands today with the flat, metallic thud of irony. It is a 79-story monument to the nickel and dime, a sanctuary built on the foundations of mass consumption, paid for in cash, by a man who sold cheap goods to the working poor. The central paradox is baked into its very mortar, a structure of profound, soul-stirring beauty designed to celebrate the most profane of human activities, the relentless accumulation of wealth. And in this pre-dawn quiet, the building seems to ask the question itself. Is grandeur a lie if it is built on a mountain of trivialities? Can a thing be both magnificent and vulgar, sacred and cynical? The walls refuse to speak. They simply stand, holding their story in the cold, unyielding embrace of steel and stone, waiting for the sun to rise and for the noise of commerce to once again drown out the whispers of its true, complicated past. To call it a skyscraper is to miss the point entirely. Other buildings of its era were exercises in engineering, muscular assertions of height and utility. They were functional beasts, their steel skeletons barely concealed by a thin veneer of masonry. They were proud of their modernity. But the Woolworth Building is something else. It is an act of deliberate, calculated deception. It is a modern marvel disguised as an ancient relic. Cass Gilbert, the architect, and Frank Woolworth, the patron, chose the language of the Gothic not out of some sentimental nostalgia for the past, but for its unparalleled ability to communicate power, permanence, and divine right. Every pointed arch, every soaring buttress, every grotesque carving was a word in a sentence designed to legitimize a new kind of American royalty, the royalty of industry. Look closely at the details, the filigree of terracotta that cloaks the steel frame. It mimics the hand-carved limestone of Chartres or Notre Dame, yet it was mass-produced in ceramic workshops, fired in kilns, and hung on the building like tiles. It is a triumph of industrial artifice, a beautiful factory-made skin stretched over a machine. This is the building's first and most profound lesson. In the New Age, even history and sanctity could be manufactured. The lobby is the thesis statement, a soaring, cross-shaped space with a vaulted ceiling that glitters with Byzantine-style mosaics. Gold leaf catches the light, throwing a warm, hallowed glow on the Pavonazzo marble walls. It feels like a chapel, a place for quiet contemplation. But the carvings are not of apostles and angels. One grotesque shows Cass Gilbert holding a model of the building. Another, tucked away, depicts Frank Woolworth himself, counting his dimes. The joke is there for all to see. a cynical wink hidden amidst the splendor. God is in the details, they say. Here, the details confirm that the new God is capital. This architectural masquerade was a necessity. Woolworth was not old money. He was not a Rockefeller or a Carnegie, whose fortunes were built on the foundational industries of oil and steel. He was a merchant, a shopkeeper on a gargantuan scale. In the rigid social hierarchy of the Gilded Age, this made him seem common, his wealth somehow less dignified. He needed a fortress of respectability, a pedigree cast in stone. The Gothic style, with its deep roots in aristocracy and the church, was the perfect camouflage. It allowed a man who built his empire on 5-cent tin pans to present himself with the gravitas of a Medici prince. The building was not just an office tower. It was an elaborate piece of social laundering, an attempt to wash the grime of retail from a colossal fortune and present it as something noble, something timeless, something chosen. To understand the tower, you must first understand the terror. Not the terror of a battlefield or a natural disaster, but the quiet, gnawing, acid-in-the-stomach terror of rural poverty in post-Civil War America. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born in a small wooden farmhouse near Great Bend, New York, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the harvest and the ever-present threat of a bad crop leading to ruin. His world was one of hard labor for little reward, of patched clothes and the dull ache of want. He was, by all accounts, an awkward, shy boy, ill-suited for the brutish realities of farm work. His escape was the local general store, a chaotic emporium of goods that seemed to him a portal to a larger, more prosperous world. It was there he first felt the humiliation that would fuel his life's ambition. Hired as an unpaid apprentice at Augsbury and Moore's dry goods store in Watertown, he was clumsy, inept at dealing with customers, and constantly derided by his employers for his lack of salesmanship. He was a failure. The feeling of worthlessness became a cold, hard knot in his chest. He was trapped in a cycle of dependency, his future dictated by the whims of men who saw him as less than nothing. The psychological wound was deep. This was the crucible in which the tycoon was forged. The fear of returning to that state of powerless insignificance, of being at the mercy of others, became the engine of his life. It was a terror so profound that no amount of money could ever truly extinguish it. It drove him with a relentless, manic energy that baffled his contemporaries. They saw ambition. They did not see the ghost of the penniless farm boy who haunted his every decision. The famous 5-cent counter was not a stroke of genius born from market analysis. It was an act of desperation. During his time as a clerk, he saw a display of cheap, miscellaneous goods with a single price sign. Any article on this counter, 5 cents. Sold out. A light went on, but it was not the light of inspiration. It was the flickering lamp of survival. Here was a system that removed the terrifying element of salesmanship. The goods sold themselves. There was no need for charm, no room for haggling, no possibility of rejection. It was a retail machine, impersonal and efficient. It was a business model perfectly suited to a man who feared human interaction but possessed an obsessive genius for systems and logistics. He would build his empire on this principle, a fortress of commerce so vast and powerful that no one could ever call him a failure again. The empire of the insignificant was a masterpiece of psychological insight. Frank Woolworth did not sell aspirations. He sold gratifications, small and immediate. He understood something fundamental about the human condition, particularly the condition of the working poor at the turn of the century. He understood that while they might not be able to afford the grand dreams peddled by other merchants, fine furniture, stylish clothes, a home of their own, they could almost always afford a nickel. That single, humble coin was the key. In a world of rigid class structures and economic hardship, the 5-and-dime store was a small pocket of democratic possibility. Inside, a factory girl or a day laborer was not judged or intimidated. They could walk the aisles, handle the goods, and for a few cents purchase something new. A tin toy, a length of ribbon, a piece of candy. It was a trivial transaction, but it contained a powerful kernel of dignity. It was the power to choose, the power to own. Woolworth was a predator of pennies, a harvester of the loose change that other, grander capitalists disdained. He built his fortune by aggregating the forgotten currency of the masses. While his competitors chased the wealthy dollar, he perfected the art of capturing the common cent, millions upon millions of times over. His genius was not in invention but in scale. He pioneered concepts that are now the bedrock of modern retail. Bulk purchasing directly from manufacturers to cut out the middleman, meticulous store layout to maximize customer flow, and an almost fanatical attention to inventory control. His stores were bright, clean, and orderly, a stark contrast to the cluttered gloom of the traditional general store. They were machines for selling, designed with the cold precision of an engineer. Yet the irony was monumental. The man who provided these small pockets of consumer agency for the masses lived a life of staggering, almost unimaginable opulence. The gap between the lives of his customers and his own became a chasm. While they debated spending a nickel on a new dishcloth, he was spending millions on French tapestries, marble statues, and eventually, a skyscraper that would scrape the heavens. He was a monarch whose kingdom was built on the disposable income of the proletariat. He never saw the contradiction. To him, his wealth was simply the logical outcome of his system, a testament to his own hard work and foresight. He was the farm boy who had made good, and the colossal fortune was his shield against the ghosts of his past. The Cathedral of Commerce, when it rose, would be the ultimate symbol of this disconnect. A palace of unimaginable grandeur funded by the purchase of countless 5-cent trinkets, a monument to a king built by the inadvertent contributions of his humblest subjects. A fortune, even one as vast as Frank Woolworth's, is just a number on a ledger. It is abstract, intangible. It cannot shelter you from the condescending gaze of old money. It cannot erase the faint, lingering scent of the farm. By the early 1900s, Woolworth was fantastically wealthy, but he was not respected. Not in the way that mattered. The established American aristocracy, the families whose names were synonymous with the nation's industrial and financial foundations, saw him as a parvenu, a glorified shopkeeper. His money was new, and in their eyes it was tainted by the grubby reality of retail. He sold cheap goods, and therefore he was cheap. This social exclusion was a source of constant private torment. It was a return to the old feeling of inadequacy he'd experienced as a young clerk, a sense that for all his success, he was still on the outside looking in. He could buy anything he wanted except a pedigree, so he decided to build one. The Woolworth building was conceived not as a commercial venture, though it would be that, but as a declaration of war on the social establishment. It was to be his dynasty made manifest, a statement of power so enormous, so undeniably magnificent, that it could not be ignored. It would be taller, grander, and more beautiful than any office building ever constructed. It would not just enter the New York skyline. It would dominate it. It would become the city's crown jewel, and by extension, he would become its king. This was a project born of deep-seated insecurity, an attempt to use architecture as a tool for social ascension. He wasn't just building an office. He was building a legacy that would dwarf those of his rivals. He famously told his architect, Cass Gilbert, "I don't want a building. I want a monument." He obsessed over every detail, not with the eye of a developer calculating return on investment, but with the fervor of a pharaoh building his own pyramid. He wanted the fastest elevators, the most ornate lobby, the most expensive materials. The cost was a secondary concern. The primary goal was to create something that would last for centuries, a structure that would forever associate the name Woolworth with grandeur and permanence, not with 5-cent novelties. The building was a 79-story argument against his own humble origins. It was an act of architectural overcompensation, a desperate attempt to build a fortress of stone and steel around a fragile ego. When people looked at it, they would not see the farm boy from Watertown. They would see a titan, a visionary, a peer of the realm. The tragedy, of course, is that a building cannot love you back, cannot grant you the acceptance you crave. It can only stand, a silent, indifferent testament to the ambition that created it. The translation of raw ambition into refined architecture required a specific kind of artist. Frank Woolworth, for all his commercial genius, knew nothing of monumental building. He had the vision of a king but the vocabulary of a merchant. To realize his dream, he needed an architect who was not just a designer, but a diplomat, a psychologist, and a master of historical styles. He found his man in Cass Gilbert. Gilbert was everything Woolworth was not: polished, educated, and firmly embedded within the architectural establishment. A student of the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, he was a master of academic classicism, an architect who understood that buildings were not merely structures, but powerful symbols that communicated social and cultural values. He had already designed state capitals and federal buildings. He knew the language of power. The partnership between the two men was a fascinating study in contrasts. On one side, the relentless, micromanaging client, a man accustomed to absolute control, who famously declared he would pay for the entire project in cash from his personal bank account to avoid dealing with bankers or financiers. On the other, the sophisticated, patient architect, who had to translate Woolworth's often vague desires for the biggest and the best into a coherent and buildable design. Their relationship was a constant negotiation. Woolworth would scrutinize every drawing, question every expense, and demand endless revisions. He was not a passive patron. He was an active and often intrusive collaborator. He famously carried a small pocket ruler to measure details on blueprints. His mind, accustomed to the minutiae of retail inventory, now applied to the scale of a metropolis. Yet Gilbert understood the psychology of his client. He recognized that Woolworth's obsession with detail was not just about money. It was about control. The building was the ultimate expression of Woolworth's will, and he needed to feel his hand on every part of it. Gilbert, with immense skill, guided Woolworth's raw energy. When Woolworth demanded a tower that would echo the Victoria Tower of the Houses of Parliament in London, Gilbert gently steered him towards a more elegant, cohesive Gothic design. He took Woolworth's desire for a monument and filtered it through his own deep knowledge of architectural history, creating a design that was both a personal statement for his client and a masterpiece of the form. The decision to pay in cash was central to the building's mythology. $13.5 million slid across the table in installments. This was not just a financial transaction. It was a performance. It was Woolworth demonstrating his absolute independence. He was beholden to no one. No banks, no investors, no board of directors. The tower was his and his alone, a physical manifestation of his liquid wealth. It was the ultimate fortress, built not just to keep out the rain, but to keep out the entire system of debt and obligation that he so deeply distrusted. The building was a sovereign entity, a kingdom of one, paid for by a king who signed his own checks. The choice of Gothic was not arbitrary. It was a weapon. In the architectural arsenal of the early 20th century, no style was more loaded with meaning, more capable of conveying a sense of ancient lineage and unquestionable authority. To clad a modern steel skyscraper in the garments of a medieval cathedral was a masterstroke of cultural appropriation. It was Woolworth and Gilbert looting the past to sanctify the present. They were borrowing the symbolic capital of the church, an institution that had dominated the Western world for 1,000 years, and applying it to a new faith, American capitalism. The cathedrals of Europe were built over generations, monuments to communal faith and the power of God. The Cathedral of Commerce was built in under 2 years, a monument to individual will and the power of the dollar. The parallel was deliberate and audacious. The building's form directly mimicked the composition of a cathedral, a grand entrance leading to a nave-like lobby, side aisles of shops, and a soaring tower reaching towards the heavens as if in supplication. But the object of worship had changed. The soaring verticality, which in a medieval context was meant to draw the soul upward toward God, was here repurposed to celebrate the ascent of a single man. It was a physical representation of the Horatio Alger myth, the farm boy who rises from the dirt to the sky. The terracotta skin was the key to this illusion. Stone was the material of the past, slow to carve, heavy to lift. Terracotta was the material of the present, lightweight, fireproof, and easily molded into complex shapes. It was a modern, industrial material that could be made to look ancient. The Atlantic Terracotta Company in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, produced over 25,000 tons of it for the Woolworth Building, a vast, intricate jigsaw puzzle of glazed ceramic. This allowed for a level of ornamentation that would have been prohibitively expensive in stone. An army of sculptors and artisans created a menagerie of gargoyles, grotesques, and delicate tracery, all of it cast, fired, and shipped to the site. The building's beauty is therefore the beauty of a replica, a flawless imitation. It is the architectural equivalent of a new millionaire buying fake ancestral portraits for his mansion. It projects a history that it does not possess. And yet, the effect is undeniably powerful. The building achieves a sense of permanence and gravitas that belies its modern construction. It manages to feel both ancient and entirely new, a hybrid creature that perfectly captured the spirit of its age, an era of immense technological change grappling with a deep-seated need for historical legitimacy. The building is a lie, but it is a beautiful, magnificent, and utterly convincing lie. Before the spire could touch the sky, the foundations had to plunge into the abyss. The construction of the Woolworth building began not with an ascent, but with a descent into the dark, wet, treacherous geology of Lower Manhattan. To support the immense weight of the steel frame, over 24,000 tons of it, the foundations had to be sunk over 100 feet below street level, past the soil and glacial till, to rest on the solid bedrock of Manhattan schist. This was the work of the sandhogs. They were a special breed of men, mostly Irish and Eastern European immigrants, who labored in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. They worked in massive steel cylinders called caissons, which were sunk into the earth. Compressed air was pumped into the caissons to keep water and mud from flooding the work chamber. The men entered and exited through airlocks, their bodies subjected to enormous changes in pressure. It was brutal, claustrophobic work, performed in near darkness, the air thick with the smell of mud and sweat. The ever-present danger was the bends, or caisson disease, a terrifying condition caused by nitrogen bubbles forming in the bloodstream if a worker decompressed too quickly. It caused excruciating joint pain, paralysis, and frequently death. There were no safety regulations to speak of, no workers' compensation. The men were a disposable resource, their lives and health wagered against the relentless schedule of construction. While Frank Woolworth planned his Napoleonic office suite in the sky, these men were digging his foundation in a man-made hell. The contrast is obscene. The newspapers of the day celebrated the project as a marvel of modern ingenuity, printing heroic photographs of the rising steel frame. They rarely, if ever, mentioned the men in the caissons. This was the invisible army, the human infrastructure upon which the Cathedral of Commerce was built. Their labor was the true foundation, a bedrock of sweat, muscle, and blood. Their names are not carved in the marble lobby. There are no statues dedicated to the sandhogs who went deaf, who were crippled by the bends, or who were killed in accidents. They are the silent, unacknowledged partners in Woolworth's grand vision. The construction of the foundation was a war fought against the earth itself, and the sandhogs were the frontline soldiers. For them, the building was not a symbol of aspiration or a monument to commerce. It was a dark, hungry mouth in the ground that demanded a daily sacrifice of human energy and, all too often, of human life. The finished tower, gleaming in the sunlight, is beautiful. Yes, but that is just the facade. Its true story begins here, in the dark, pressurized silence beneath the city streets. Once the foundations were set, the skeleton rose. It was a spectacle of organized chaos, a vertical ballet of steel and men. The age of the skyscraper was still young, and its construction was a raw, visceral process. There were no tower cranes as we know them today. Instead, a series of derricks were mounted on the highest completed floor, hoisting the massive steel girders up from the street below. As each new floor was completed, the derricks were jumped to the new level, climbing the building with it. The city watched, mesmerized, as the frame grew at a breathtaking pace, sometimes as much as 2 floors a week. The dominant figures in this aerial world were the riveting gangs. Typically a team of 4, they performed a dangerous, high-altitude dance. The heater would heat the rivets to a cherry-red glow in a small coal-fired forge. The catcher stood perilously on a beam, often dozens of floors in the air, holding a tin can to catch the rivet tossed by the heater. He would then pick the white-hot rivet out of the can with tongs and place it in the hole in the girder. On the other side, the bucker-up would hold a heavy dolly against the rivet head, while the gunman hammered the other end into a permanent bond with a pneumatic riveting gun. The deafening, staccato rat-a-tat-tat of the riveting guns became the anthem of the new New York, a percussive declaration of the city's relentless upward ambition. These men, the Sky Boys, became folk heroes, symbols of a new kind of American masculinity, fearless, agile, and utterly at home in the vertical world they were creating. Photographs from the era show them strolling casually along narrow beams, eating their lunches with their legs dangling 800 feet above the pavement, the city sprawling beneath them like a map. The images are breathtaking, but they sanitize the brutal reality. There were no safety nets, no harnesses, no hard hats. A single misstep, a moment of gusting wind, meant certain death. Dozens of men fell during the construction of the great skyscrapers of this era. They were part of the cost of doing business, their deaths barely registering as a footnote in the triumphant narrative of progress. The Woolworth building was a machine that consumed not only steel and money, but also men. It was assembled piece by piece through the coordinated efforts of thousands of workers, each performing a specialized task in a vast, complex choreography. It was a human beehive, driven by the relentless logic of the construction schedule. From the ground, it looked like a miracle. From inside the rising frame, it was a loud, dirty, and lethally dangerous factory in the sky. If the steel frame was the building's skeleton, the terracotta was its skin. This was not a mere decorative afterthought. It was an integral part of the building's identity, the very medium through which it told its Gothic story. The creation and application of this ceramic veneer was a monumental feat of industrial artistry, a process that married ancient craft with modern production techniques. The journey of a single terracotta panel began not in Manhattan, but in the vast clay pits of New Jersey. At the Atlantic Terracotta Company, master sculptors, working from Cass Gilbert's detailed drawings, first created full-size plaster models of every gargoyle, finial, and piece of tracery. These models were then used to create molds, into which a refined clay mixture was pressed. The hollow, unadorned clay shapes were then sent to the finishing room, where artisans hand-carved the finer details, ensuring that each piece, though born from a mold, had a touch of individuality. This was the delicate balance, the efficiency of mass production combined with the nuance of handcraftsmanship. After finishing, the pieces were sprayed with a glaze, a liquid mixture of minerals that, when fired, would give the terracotta its color and its protective, glass-like surface. The Woolworth building's distinctive color palette, a creamy, limestone-like white with highlights of blue, green, and saffron yellow, was the result of a carefully controlled chemical science. Finally, the pieces were loaded into massive beehive kilns and fired at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for over a week. This intense heat transformed the soft clay into a material as hard as stone. The process was fraught with risk. A slight variation in temperature could ruin an entire batch. The finished, cooled pieces were then numbered according to a complex key, loaded onto barges, and shipped across the harbor to the construction site, where they were hoisted up and bolted onto the steel frame by teams of masons. It was a jigsaw puzzle of epic proportions, with thousands of unique pieces that had to fit together perfectly hundreds of feet in the air. This intricate skin served multiple purposes. It was fireproof, a critical concern after the great city fires of the 19th century. It was lightweight, reducing the load on the steel skeleton. But most importantly, it was plastic. It could be molded into the ornate, expressive forms that the Gothic style demanded, forms that would have been impossible or astronomically expensive to achieve in carved stone. The terracotta skin is the soul of the building's aesthetic. It is what allows the Cathedral of Commerce to perform its great masquerade, to wear the robes of a medieval church while possessing the body of a modern machine. $13.5 million. It is a number that, even today, has a satisfying heft. In 1913, it was an absurdity, a figure so colossal as to be almost meaningless. To put it in perspective, it was equivalent to more than $1/3 billion in today's currency. But the raw number does not capture the true weight of Woolworth's financial undertaking. The most astonishing fact was not the amount, but the method of payment. Cash. No mortgage. No bonds. No syndicate of investors. Frank Woolworth paid for his monument out of pocket, from the torrent of nickels and dimes that flowed into his company's coffers. This was an act of supreme financial arrogance, a display of wealth so profound that it bordered on performance art. Each payment to the construction company was a personal check drawn on his own account. He was not just funding a building. He was transmuting the ephemeral profits of his retail empire into something solid, something real, something that could not vanish in a market panic. The decision to avoid debt was rooted in the deep psychological terror of his youth. Debt, to him, was a form of servitude. It was the state of being beholden to another man's power, the very condition he had spent his entire life escaping. By paying in cash, he ensured that his tower would be his alone, a sovereign territory in the heart of the world's financial capital. It was a fortress against the very system that had made him rich. He was building his own private mountain, and he would owe no one for the privilege of standing on its peak. The bills kept coming, a relentless paper tide. Payroll for thousands of workers, invoices for 24,000 tons of steel, bills for 17 million bricks, receipts for 25,000 tons of terracotta. The numbers were astronomical, but Woolworth met them without flinching. His obsession with the project's finances was legendary. He scrutinized every expense, arguing over the cost of doorknobs and window fittings with the same intensity he applied to the stock levels in his stores. The building was the ultimate inventory item, and he managed it with a terrifying meticulousness. This flow of cash was the lifeblood of the project. It ensured that construction never paused for lack of funds, that materials arrived on time, that the army of labor was paid. It allowed the building to rise at its astonishing pace, a testament not just to engineering prowess, but to the sheer, overwhelming power of liquid capital. When the building was complete, it was not just the tallest in the world. It was arguably the most financially solvent piece of real estate on the planet. It stood free and clear, a pure asset, an unencumbered monument to the man who had willed it and paid for it into existence. The building was designed as a city within a city, a perfectly stratified vertical society. And like any city, it had its public squares and its hidden machinery, its glittering avenues and its dark, utilitarian alleys. The lobby was the public square, the grand portico of this new urban world. It was a space designed to awe, to inspire, and to intimidate. Walking in from the grime and chaos of Broadway was like stepping into another reality. The air grew quiet, reverent. The scale of the space, with its 60-foot-high vaulted ceilings, was deliberately overwhelming, designed to make the individual feel small and insignificant in the face of such magnificent capital. The light, filtered through stained glass skylights and reflected off acres of gold mosaic, was warm and ethereal, the light of a sanctuary. This was the public face of the Woolworth Empire. Beautiful, orderly, and immensely powerful. But this opulent display was supported by a vast and entirely invisible infrastructure, a hidden world of machinery and labor that made the illusion possible. Deep in the subbasements, far below the marble floors, was the building's heart, a massive power plant, complete with its own towering smokestack hidden within the building's core. It generated all the electricity needed to light the tower and run its machinery. It was a self-sufficient organism, capable of surviving a citywide blackout. Here, in the heat and the noise, engineers and stokers, their faces slick with sweat and coal dust, tended the boilers and generators. They were the engine room crew of a great landbound vessel. The building's circulatory system was its bank of elevators, the fastest and safest in the world at the time. They were a marvel of technology, equipped with air cushions in the shaft bottoms that could supposedly bring a falling car to a gentle stop. For the tenants in the offices above, the elevators were a silent, swift convenience. For the operators, mostly young men in crisp uniforms, it was a day of repetitive vertical motion, opening and closing brass gates, announcing floors in a monotone voice, a life lived in a moving box. The building had its own water supply, drawn from a well sunk deep into the bedrock. It had its own fire suppression system, its own internal communications network, its own army of cleaners who, under the cloak of night, would descend upon the offices and corridors, scrubbing, polishing, and erasing the traces of the day's commerce, ensuring that the illusion of effortless perfection was ready again by morning. This was the vertical upstairs/downstairs dynamic. The wealth and power were on display in the sunlit offices high above, while the work that supported it all was done in the dark, hot, unseen spaces below, or by a nocturnal army that remained invisible to the powerful men who paid their wages. April 24, 1913, the culmination, the night of the triumph. All of New York society, the very people Frank Woolworth had sought to impress, were gathered for a lavish banquet in his honor. The guest list was a roll call of American power: governors, senators, financiers, and industrialists. At 7:30 p.m., a hush fell over the crowd. A telegraph connection had been established with the White House. 200 miles away, President Woodrow Wilson reached for a ceremonial button. He pressed it. In that instant, a signal flashed from Washington to New York, closing a circuit in the subbasement of the new tower. And the building bloomed. 80,000 incandescent light bulbs, strategically placed along its Gothic lines, blazed to life, transforming the colossal structure into a tower of pure light. It was the most spectacular electrical display the world had ever seen. The city gasped. From miles away, on ships in the harbor and from rooftops in the outer boroughs, people watched as the tallest building on Earth announced its arrival. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph for Frank Woolworth. He had done it. The farm boy from Watertown had placed his glowing signature upon the New York skyline. The newspapers the next day were effusive. They called it a masterpiece, a monument to peace and commerce, the eighth wonder of the world. The Reverend S. Parks Cadman, in a moment of soaring hyperbole that would define the building's identity, dubbed it the Cathedral of Commerce. The name stuck because it was perfect. It captured the building's sacred aura and its profane purpose in a single memorable phrase. For Woolworth, this was the ultimate validation. He had forced the world to acknowledge his greatness. He had built something that could not be dismissed as cheap or common. He had created a landmark, a symbol not just of his own success, but of the boundless potential of American capitalism itself. The trap was built, and it was beautiful. But in the warm glow of the celebration, no one could see the shadows beginning to gather at the base of the tower. No one could know that this moment of supreme achievement was also the beginning of an end. The monument was complete, but the man who built it would find that living within its shadow was a very different thing from dreaming of its creation. The peak of the mountain is often a cold and lonely place. The view from the 24th floor was imperial. Frank Woolworth's private office was a fantasy of power, a suite decorated in the opulent French Empire style of his hero, Napoleon Bonaparte. He sat at a massive marble and bronze desk, a throne from which he could survey his domain. Through the large windows, he could see the city spread out below him, the harbor, the Statue of Liberty, the endless sprawl of the metropolis he had conquered. He was, quite literally, on top of the world he had created. Yet the grandeur was a gilded cage. The building, intended as a monument to his power, became a symbol of his isolation. He had built a fortress so effective that it locked him inside. He spent his days in the hushed, rarefied atmosphere of his sky palace, increasingly detached from the bustling, chaotic energy of the five-and-dime stores that were the source of his wealth. The tower was a silent, demanding companion. Its maintenance was a constant concern, its identity inextricably linked with his own. He was no longer just a man. He was the man who built the Woolworth building. The weight of this new identity was immense. The colossal fortune, symbolized by the tower, did not bring peace to his family. It acted as a corrosive agent, dissolving the bonds of intimacy and creating a world of artifice and expectation. His wife, Jenny, who had been with him since the lean years in Watertown, retreated from the overwhelming scale of their new life. Plagued by illness and dementia, she lived in seclusion, a ghost haunting their Fifth Avenue mansion, a world away from the man plotting his commercial strategies in his downtown skyscraper. The legacy of the fortune would prove even more toxic for the generations to come. His granddaughter, Barbara Hutton, the poor little rich girl, would become a global cautionary tale. She inherited a vast portion of the Woolworth wealth but lived a life of tragic, headline-grabbing excess, marked by disastrous marriages, profligate spending, and profound unhappiness. The money, and the name that came with it, was not a gift. It was a burden, a curse that promised everything but delivered only emptiness. Frank Woolworth had sought to build a dynasty, to secure his family's place for generations. But the foundation he laid was not love or stability. It was money. The tower stood as a perfect, gleaming symbol of his achievement, but it offered no sanctuary from the quiet tragedies unfolding within his own family. It was a monument to a public victory that masked a private failure. The walls of his Napoleonic office could not protect him from the loneliness of his own creation. The world that had celebrated the Woolworth Building in 1913 was a world of boundless optimism, a gilded age convinced of its own permanence and manifest destiny. It was a world that believed in progress, in industry, and in the divine right of capital. That world was about to die violently in the muddy trenches of Europe. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 shattered the era's illusions. The confident, forward-looking spirit that had raised the great skyscrapers was replaced by a new, darker mood of anxiety and disillusionment. The Cathedral of Commerce, once a symbol of peaceful prosperity, now seemed like a relic from a more naive age. The war changed everything. It reordered global power, unleashed new and terrifying technologies of destruction, and left a deep psychological scar on the Western world. Against this backdrop of global cataclysm, the ambitions of a single tycoon and his monumental office building began to seem small, almost quaint. For Frank Woolworth, the final years were a slow, painful decline. The relentless drive that had propelled him from the farm to the pinnacle of the New York skyline began to falter. His health deteriorated. He suffered from dental infections that, in the era before antibiotics, led to systemic illness. The man who had micromanaged a commercial empire and a colossal construction project became increasingly frail and withdrawn. He died on April 8, 1919, just shy of his 67th birthday. He had lived in his completed monument for less than 6 years. The creator was gone, but the creation remained, cold, silent, and indifferent. A building does not mourn. It simply stands. With Woolworth's death, the building was unmoored from its original purpose. It was no longer a personal statement, a 79-story extension of one man's ego. It became something else. A piece of real estate, a landmark, an architectural artifact. Its meaning began to drift, to be reinterpreted by a new generation that had not known the man who built it. The building had achieved the permanence its creator had craved, but in doing so, it had outgrown him, forgotten him. The name Woolworth remained on the entrance, but it slowly detached from the man and became simply the name of the building, a historical label rather than a declaration of ownership. The tower had won. It had outlived its master, its future now in the hands of others, its story just beginning. 10 years after Frank Woolworth's death, the economic system that he had so masterfully exploited collapsed upon itself. The stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression plunged the nation into a decade of unprecedented hardship. The roaring capitalism that the Woolworth Building had been built to celebrate had devolved into a nightmare of breadlines, bank failures, and mass unemployment. The tower, once the gleaming crown of a prosperous city, now stood as a silent, mocking witness to the devastation below. From its upper floors, one could look down upon a city gripped by despair. On the streets where shoppers had once bustled, now stood legions of the unemployed. In the shadow of the world's most opulent lobby, men sold apples on street corners to feed their families. The Cathedral of Commerce had become a monument to a fallen religion. The hubris of its creation was laid bare. Its soaring, optimistic verticality felt like a cruel joke in a world that had been brought to its knees. The building's economic fortunes mirrored the nation's. The demand for prime office space evaporated. Tenants defaulted on their leases and moved out. The tower, which had been a symbol of immense profitability, became a financial burden. Its value plummeted. For the first time, the great building felt the cold touch of failure. It was no longer an unassailable fortress of capital, but just another property struggling to stay afloat in a sea of red ink. The contrast between the building's interior splendor and the exterior reality was stark and painful. The gold leaf mosaics in the lobby glittered over the heads of men in threadbare coats seeking a moment's warmth. The gargoyles stared down, their stony faces seeming to pass judgment on the failed promise of the American dream. The building that was meant to represent the permanence of wealth became a powerful symbol of its transience. It was a lesson carved in terracotta. The fortunes of men and the monuments they build are subject to the violent, unpredictable currents of history. The Depression stripped the building of its triumphant narrative. It was no longer just a monument to Frank Woolworth's ego. It was now also a monument to the Great Crash, a gilded relic of a lost world, its beauty tinged with the melancholy of an era that had ended in catastrophic failure. For the next half-century, the Woolworth building settled into a long and quiet middle age. Its reign as the world's tallest building was brief, surpassed by the Chrysler Building and then the Empire State Building in the skyscraper boom of the early 1930s. As the city's center of gravity shifted north to Midtown, the tower in Lower Manhattan began a slow fade from the center of public consciousness. It was no longer the star of the skyline, but a respected elder statesman, a beautiful but increasingly overlooked part of the architectural ensemble. It became part of the background, a familiar shape that people took for granted. The building aged. The New York air, thick with coal smoke and industrial pollutants, began to take its toll on the delicate terracotta skin. The once creamy facade grew grimy, stained by decades of acid rain. Small pieces of ornamentation chipped and fell, necessitating the installation of safety netting. The brilliant gold leaf in the lobby dulled, covered by a patina of dust and time. The building was still magnificent, but its splendor was now weathered, its beauty infused with a new character of melancholy and decay. The building passed through different hands. The Woolworth Company, which had sold the building in the 1930s to raise cash, eventually moved its headquarters out. New tenants came and went. The tower became just another office building, its grand history a point of interest for tourists but largely irrelevant to the daily business conducted within its walls. Yet the building endured. It watched as the world changed around it. It saw the rise of the automobile, the invention of television, the dawn of the atomic age, the social upheavals of the 1960s. It stood through economic booms and busts, through blackouts and parades. The building became a silent repository of memory. Its walls seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the century, the clatter of a million typewriters, the murmur of countless business deals, the echoes of footsteps in its long, empty corridors at night. It was no longer a monument to one man. It had become a monument to the city itself, a patient observer of the relentless, chaotic, beautiful flow of urban life. It remembered, even as the city around it was consumed by a perpetual fever of demolition and reinvention. The building learned the great lesson of all architecture. To survive is to become invisible, to blend so perfectly into the fabric of a place that it becomes unimaginable without you. History is a process of rediscovery. An object can sit in plain sight for decades, overlooked and undervalued, until a shift in cultural perspective suddenly brings it back into focus, allowing it to be seen in a new light. For the Woolworth Building, this moment of rediscovery began in the latter half of the 20th century, driven by a growing movement for historic preservation. A new generation of architects, historians, and critics began to look at the buildings of the early skyscraper era not as obsolete relics, but as irreplaceable artistic and cultural artifacts. The Woolworth Building, with its unique synthesis of modern engineering and historical fantasy, was reappraised as a masterpiece. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1966 and a New York City Landmark in 1983. These designations were more than just legal protections. They were a formal acknowledgement of the building's significance. They marked a crucial shift in its identity. The building was no longer seen primarily through the lens of Frank Woolworth's ambition. The narrative shifted from the patron to the artist. Cass Gilbert, the architect, was elevated to the story's hero. Critics and scholars celebrated his genius in solving the complex aesthetic problem of the tall building, his masterful use of materials, his creation of a structure that was both powerfully functional and transcendently beautiful. The focus moved from the why of its creation, the insecure ego of a tycoon, to the how of its execution, the brilliant artistry of its design. Tourists began to flock to the lobby, not to pay homage to the god of commerce, but to appreciate the Byzantine mosaics and the soaring Gothic arches. They took photographs of the whimsical grotesques of Woolworth and Gilbert, seeing them not as acts of hubris, but as charming historical details. The building was being recontextualized. It was shedding its identity as a purely commercial object and taking on a new one as a work of public art. This process reveals the fluidity of meaning. A building is not a static object with a single, fixed story. Its meaning is constantly being renegotiated by the society that surrounds it. The Cathedral of Commerce, once a potent symbol of raw, unapologetic capitalism, was slowly being transformed into a beloved piece of cultural heritage. Its sharp, cynical edges were being softened by the warm glow of nostalgia. The building was becoming safe, its complicated, often brutal history smoothed over into a more palatable narrative of architectural genius and Gilded Age glamour. The latest chapter in the building's story is perhaps its most ironic. In the early 21st century, a new Gilded Age dawned, fueled by global finance and technology. A new class of ultra-wealthy individuals sought out unique and prestigious addresses, and their eyes fell upon the old Cathedral of Commerce. A developer bought the top 30 floors of the tower and began the painstaking process of converting them into a small number of palatial, multi-million-dollar residences. The project, named the Woolworth Tower Residences, transformed the upper reaches of the building into one of the most exclusive addresses on the planet. The pinnacle of the tower, once a public observation deck, became a 5-level penthouse apartment, a private kingdom in the sky. The ultimate symbol of Frank Woolworth's public triumph has been privatized. The monument he built to declare his power to the world has been subdivided and sold off to a new generation of anonymous plutocrats. The building that was once the headquarters of a vast commercial empire, a bustling hub of daily work for thousands of people, now houses a silent, sparsely populated vertical gated community. The irony is staggering. Woolworth, the king of the five and dime, built his palace with the pennies of the masses. Today, that palace is accessible only to the 0.1%. The building has come full circle. It began as a monument to the staggering inequality of the first Gilded Age, and it has found a new purpose as a luxury commodity in the second. We can now return to the physical present, standing in the street, looking up. The lights on in the upper floors are no longer the lights of late-night office workers. They are the lights of private homes, of kitchens and living rooms suspended 700 feet in the air. The building's Gothic skin, once a costume for a commercial enterprise, now serves as a historical veneer for luxury living. It provides a sense of history and authenticity for a class of people whose wealth is often abstract and placeless. The building, once again, is performing a service for the wealthy, laundering new money, giving it a place, a story, and the unimpeachable pedigree of a landmark. The cycle of wealth, power, and hubris repeats, forever finding new forms, forever housed in the same old, beautiful structures. So we return to where we began, in the pre-dawn silence, the great tower holding itself against the fading night. What has it taught us, this Cathedral of Commerce? It is not a simple lesson. It is a story of contradictions. It teaches us that beauty can be born from ugliness, from the raw, insecure hunger of a single man and the brutal, anonymous labor of thousands. It shows us that permanence is an illusion, that the meanings we carve in stone are as fluid as the passing clouds, subject to the whims of economic cycles and the shifting perspectives of history. The building is a mirror. In its gleaming terracotta facade, we see the reflection of our own complex and often troubling relationship with money, ambition, and the desire to leave a mark on the world. It reflects the relentless American drive to build, to create, to rise, but also the loneliness and isolation that can be found at the very peak of achievement. Frank Woolworth built his tower to secure a legacy, to ensure he would never be forgotten. In that, he succeeded. We remember his name because of this building. But what do we remember? We don't remember a happy man, a beloved father, or a benevolent leader. We remember a tycoon, a visionary, a man driven by ghosts, who built a magnificent cage for himself. The building stands as his grand, melancholy epitaph. It is a testament to the fact that you can build the tallest building in the world, but you cannot build a fortress against your own humanity. In the end, the most profound statement the building makes is its silence. It has outlived its creator, his family, his company, and the very era that conceived it. It has watched empires rise and fall, not just of nations, but of finance and industry. It remains impassive, beautiful, and empty of all the human drama that filled its halls. It is a monument not to commerce, but to time itself. The final, quiet truth of the Woolworth building is that the things we build to make ourselves immortal are the very things that reveal our ultimate insignificance. They stay and we go. The sun rises, the light catches the golden spire, and the city begins to stir. The Cathedral of Commerce prepares for another day, holding its secrets, guarding its silence.